So we always talk about the best number 1 picks of all time and the worst number 1 picks of all time. But actually, the majority of number 1 picks never get talked about because they were not amazing but still very good, not bad at all. Most of these guys were former All-Stars, but they were never legendary players like other number 1 picks we still talk about today. In this video, it's time to give those guys their time to shine. How's it going, folks? My name's Andy, and today we're going to take a look at 8 number 1 draft picks who were pretty good, but rarely ever talked about anymore. Number 8's Mychal Thompson. The 1978 draft was known to be the draft of Larry Bird. Bird was drafted at number 6, and obviously he became the best player of that class. But Mychal Thompson, Clay's father, was the guy drafted at number 1, and very few people know about him. We never mentioned Mychal Thompson as a bust, even though he never made a single All-Star team, and we also never mentioned him as one of the best number 1 picks ever, because frankly, he doesn't fit into either category. That's because for most of his career, he was putting up great numbers on fringe playoff teams. In his first 7 seasons, he averaged nearly 17 points and 9 rebounds a game in Portland during the 1980s. He even led his team in scoring in 1982, but that was basically it, as Portland was never a real contender during that time and would continue to lose in the first or second rounds. It wasn't until the late 1980s when he joined the Showtime Lakers and won some championships. But he did that while coming off the bench, and he was no longer a core part of the team. Number 7, Elton Brand. A relatively recent player on this list, but most have already forgotten how good he was during his prime. We only mention him now because he's the Sixers GM. Drafted by Chicago in 1999, he was the guy who fans hoped could lead the Bulls back into the playoffs after the Michael Jordan era was over. Initially, it worked out well because Brand came crashing out of the gates and instantly played like a star. For his first 2 years in Chicago, he would average 20 and 10, but then the Bulls made one of the worst trades ever, essentially trading away their young, rising star for 2 high schoolers, Tyson Chandler and Eddie Curry, who didn't accomplish anything in Chicago. Later on, Brand would become an All-Star with the LA Clippers and even lead them to the 2006 Western Conference semifinals. He even finished 7th in MVP voting that year. Unfortunately, Brand would also spend most of his career missing the playoffs or getting knocked out early on, and also suffered a terrible Achilles injury at 28 years old, an injury that he never recovered from. Although he was never a top-tier power forward in the ranks of Garnett, Duncan, or Nowitzki, he was still right below them. That's pretty damn good. Number 6, David Thompson. Hey, you remember this guy? Yeah, he was standing right next to Michael Jordan during his Hall of Fame speech. That's David Thompson. Jordan said that Thompson was his role model growing up and the guy who he modeled his game after, and that's why he was up there with him during his speech. Jordan would watch Thompson destroy everybody at North Carolina State as he earned the nickname Skywalker. Thompson brought that same mentality and same playstyle to the NBA, where he was drafted first in 1975. The high-flying dunks, the insane athleticism and speed, all of these things made Thompson into the most exciting player in college basketball, and in his first couple years in the NBA too. There were also things that inspired Jordan to take his game to the next level. Thompson had a very successful start to his NBA career, making 4 straight All-Star games, and earned 2 All-NBA first-team selections. He was averaging over 25 points a game. In 1978, he would also sign the biggest contract in NBA history. Well, at the time, it was the biggest, a 5-year, $4 million deal to stay with the Denver Nuggets. Unfortunately, as the years went by, Thompson would fall under the influence of drugs and alcohol. Then, by the age of 29, he would be out of the NBA because of the aggressive substance abuse. And also because he suffered a really bad knee injury while partying in New York. That was the final nail in the coffin. When looking back at his career, Thompson regrets what happened. As he said, "I had the ability to be one of the greatest basketball players in the history of the game, and I blew it." Number 5, Danny Manning. The 1988 draft as a whole was quite underwhelming. There's only one Hall of Famer from that class, and that was Mitch Richmond. Danny Manning had a pretty good career too, though. In his first 6 years, he averaged about 19 points a game, made 2 All-Star teams, and was a bit different from the average power forward. He was a phenomenal passer and also a very agile post-up player. He didn't really score with power, but mostly through finesse. Manning could extend his game outside the paint as well and was a versatile defender because of his quickness. Unfortunately, he was playing for the Clippers in the 1990s, who weren't getting anywhere. On top of that, Manning's success started to dwindle as knee problems plagued his later years. It also didn't help that he tore his ACL in his rookie season, and it took him a while to get back on track. While it looked like he did fully recover, the pain in his knees would continue for the rest of his career. By the time he got traded to a contending team like Phoenix, he was just a role player, although he did win 6th Man of the Year. Number 4, Kenyon Martin. Now, you guys know how I feel about the 2000 NBA draft. It was a crapshoot. In most other years, Kenyon Martin would probably be considered as a bust, but since it's the 2000 draft, the expectations weren't that high. In his first couple years, he was part of those Nets teams who reached the finals. Martin was a core piece of the team as he was a great pick-and-roll partner for Jason Kidd, and also took on the task of defending the dominant power forwards of that era. It was a lot to handle, especially for a young guy like Kmart, but he did it quite well. Later on, he would join the Denver Nuggets and have a hard time integrating himself with the team. He had some confrontations with coach George Karl, and he also sat out for almost an entire season due to microfracture surgery. While Martin came into the league and had a strong start, he didn't really improve as he got older. He was still the same hyper-athletic player who only wanted to dunk the ball and hit the occasional jumper. After bouncing around the league for a few more times, Martin would retire in 2015 at the age of 37. He did make one All-Star team in his 15 seasons, but he's probably the closest guy on this list to being a bust. It's just that it's hard to call him a bust when you look at the other players drafted after him. Yikes. Number 3, Larry Johnson. The most famous highlight of Larry Johnson's career was this.
11 and 9/10 seconds to go. Ward with a penalty, but guarded tightly. Johnson cuts left, now fires a three. It is good, and he's fouled!
The 4-point play that gave the Knicks a 2-1 series lead in the 1999 Eastern Conference Finals. The year that they had an incredible Cinderella run, but couldn't pull it off at the end. At this point of Larry's career, he was only a role player, years removed from his days as an All-Star. But in the early days in Charlotte, Larry Johnson and Alonzo Mourning formed a formidable duo and led the Hornets to a couple of playoff appearances. Larry averaged about 20 points, 9 rebounds, and 4 assists per game in his time in Charlotte. Over the years, he also transformed his game. Previously, he was strictly a post-up player and undersized bruiser who bullied people in the paint, kinda similar to Charles Barkley. But after a couple issues with his back, he slowly became a better jump shooter. By the time he arrived in New York, the Patrick Ewing era was coming to an end, and they pretty much had a ragtag team of guys who had a miraculous run to the finals. Larry was more of a complementary piece, a stretch forward to help out their main guys, Allen Houston and Latrell Sprewell. Out of every other player on this list, Larry is probably the most well-known. At least to me he is, because I remember when I was a kid watching him on the Knicks. In most games, he wouldn't do that much, but occasionally he'd explode and score over 30 points. If he didn't have those back issues, he could have still been playing like an all-star back in Charlotte. Those chronic back problems would force him to retire at the age of 32. Number 2, Brad Daugherty. Brad Daugherty was another guy who was a perennial all-star, but chronic back issues ruined his career and forced him to retire at just 28 years old. He was drafted in 1986 and was part of those Cavs teams who made it deep into the playoffs. And in other years, they would get whipped by Jordan and the Bulls. In Brad's best years, he would average about 20, 10, and 4. By the age of 27, he was already a 5-time All-Star and one of the best, most underrated centers in the league. Brad was a legit 7-footer, weighing about 250 pounds, he had long arms, but also had a soft touch around the rim. Just like Danny Manning, Brad was an excellent passer out of the block. The Cavs would frequently set up their offense through Brad because of how good his court vision was. Unfortunately, he wasn't the best defender and he was pretty slow on his feet. Imagine somebody like Brook Lopez back in the day when he used to post up all the time. Brad was kinda similar, but a much better passer. It's sad his career ended so quickly, but by 1994, him and the Cavs accomplished as much as they could have hoped for. They just weren't good enough to get past the Bulls or other contenders in the East. However, I do think if he never got injured, he would be talked about a lot more, and was possibly on his way to a Hall of Fame career. And number 1, before we get into that, here's some context on this situation. The 1994 draft was memorable for a couple reasons. It was mainly because that was the year that Jason Kidd and Grant Hill came into the league, with the number 2 pick and number 3 pick respectively. They even won co-Rookie of the Year together, and over the course of their careers they were always compared to each other. They even entered the Hall of Fame together in the exact same year. Fate has bound these two great players together. So, who was the number 1 pick of the 1994 draft? Well, it was Glenn Robinson, a player drafted ahead of 2 legends but never talked about. Was he a bust? Did the Bucks make a mistake and should have taken Kidd or Hill instead? Robinson was a great player right out of the gates, but because he never had the flash or the superstar status of Kidd or Hill, he was swept under the rug and barely looked at. While the other two were making waves, Robinson was trying to bring a struggling Milwaukee Bucks team back into the playoffs. By 2001, the Bucks had a big three consisting of him, Ray Allen, and Sam Cassell. Robinson was the leading scorer on that team. The Bucks were 1 game away from reaching the finals in 2001 in a rather controversial series, where the Bucks felt like the Sixers were getting all of the calls. In fact, in that series, Robinson did not even attempt a single free throw until Game 5. In the next couple years, he got traded a couple times and then landed in San Antonio, where he would win a championship coming off the bench. Afterwards, he would retire at the age of 32, with 2 All-Star appearances and career averages of about 21 points, 6 rebounds, and 3 assists per game. And that's all, folks. Those were 8 forgotten number 1 draft picks who were actually really good. Very few people talk about or know about these guys, so I thought I'd make a video to give them the spotlight. Not every number 1 pick is gonna be LeBron or Tim Duncan or Shaq, but these guys had successful careers in their own way. Let me know your thoughts on anybody else who should have been mentioned. Thank you everybody so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, I'll see you next time. Peace.